Okay. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome this afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Zoom call with Robert Luckett and Andre, who you all know. Before we get started with introductions, just a couple little Zoom housekeeping matters. If you use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, if you click on that, and then if you look over on the right-hand side, you'll see a little blue box, and make sure that you indicate that that it's open for so that you can see panelists and attendees, and that in that space is where you can type in your questions once we get going. So Andre and Robert will start things off, and then they'll indicate when, but you can just use that function as we go along. Okay. And if you have any problems with anything, just let us know and we'll take care of it for you. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Deborah Eliezer from the Nation Travel Program, and I've been in touch with pretty much all of you at some point or another, certainly regarding this call, but regarding your tours with us. And actually, I'm sorry, going back again, when you go into the chat function, if you can please indicate your name and the month and year that you traveled with us on the Civil Rights Tour, that would be fabulous. So we can see everyone, and then you can see people who you may have traveled with. So it'd be great. So at this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Andre, who will facilitate things this afternoon. So Andre, thank you for joining us, and Robert, thank you. And please go ahead.
Great, thanks so much, Deborah. And hello to everyone. There's so many of you here that we had to turn off the feature where we would allow ourselves to see you. So we're just seeing a bunch of us, being Robert and me chatting. So we'll take your questions and go through them. Hi, everybody. Oh, so great to see all the names popping up. So we'll start off, I'll say a few little things, and then I'll let Robert say a few things. And then I'll ask Robert 1 or 2 questions that you all submitted. And then we'll pay attention to questions that appear in the chat and have a conversation. This grew from one of our travelers actually saying that they would like to have a dialogue about what's happening in the world right now and have a conversation come together. And, the Nation magazine, we love our travelers, and we wanted to have a conversation with you all and just bring forward someone. So Robert reached out to me and said, let's do this. And here we are today. So I am in New York City, and I have been busy, as you all can imagine, I bet, right now, working on all kinds of programs on facilitating, have a dialogue and conversations with people about these issues. I'll share with you all that I've been having a recurring dream where I wake up and I'm screaming into the void, I told you, but nonetheless, here we are in this moment, this really revolutionary, intense moment. So let's, Robert, how about you? What's going on for you, and where are you right now?
Yeah, I'm in Jackson. We are, of course, working from home like so many other people, and it's fun to see the chat and see all the people who've come on the trip over the several years now that we've been having you guys, particularly come to COFO and come to Jackson into Mississippi. The last 6 weeks for us and the work I do, and I think most people here know that I'm a civil rights historian at Jackson State University and run the COFO Civil Rights Education Center and the Margaret Walker Center. About early May, we were preparing for the 50th commemoration of police shootings at Jackson State in 1970, May 14th and 15th. And of course, we had to move to a virtual program. And ahead of it, I wrote an op-ed that some of you have seen in the New York Times. And for me, with visitors when they come to COFO and when I get to meet with them, I think it's incredibly important for us to understand a couple of things. One, in particular, how our history informs our present, and 2, how what happens in Mississippi is a function of what's happening in this nation, right? What's happening in America. Mississippi is as much a part of America as it is apart from America. And so I've always tried to emphasize that to folks, right? And there was this moment in time with the 50th commemoration of the police shootings where the story of Ahmaud Arbery had just come out. Of course, we're in the middle of the pandemic, and it just struck me how much systemic violence aimed at marginalized and Black and brown communities remains a consistent part of the American story. And then over the next, of course, 4 or 5 weeks, we had just this explosion of social justice activism, and just reinforce with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these names now that are seared into us, reinforced how much we are still tied to that kind of white supremacist past, and that just systematic use of violence to maintain power in this country. And in some ways, it's also been really invigorating and inspiring to see the people taking to the streets and taking it upon themselves to launch a new, another generation of activists into fighting for a more just world. So since early May, we've been very busy, and just the attention and as much engagement around these issues has been happening has been it's been a lot, but it's also been inspiring and also troublesome for sure.
So you wrote your article in May. It was published May 14th, and here we are, June. What is today? June the 16th.
Yeah, a month.
So how would you say you see things being different from that period till now? What would you have also included in there relative to what's happening with the police officers, that some are being charged, some are not? What's between now and then?
What's been particularly amazing in just the last couple of weeks is how the conversation has changed from people being sympathetic and empathetic to the plight of these marginalized communities, to taking action and to thinking about ways to implement change in how we police our communities and how we provide social services to underserved populations, right? How we bring justice in these cases of what's very clearly murder, right? And homicide and assault. Where is the justice? And the outpouring of people to really begin changing how that happens. I saw the story today where the city of San Francisco is going to stop sending police to nonviolent, right, calls. They're going to send professionals instead. And so, there's a moment in time where there's actual conversation. For some of you will be amazed to know, if you haven't been paying attention to Mississippi news, our state legislature is considering taking down the state flag finally. There's legislation in the state Senate. And so, and I think most of you know that we're the last state flag that still contains the Confederate battle emblem. The very fact that that's now on the floor of our state legislature and people are having these conversations and discussions, that's what's changed, and what has changed in a relatively quick period of time. The issues are still there. We're still fighting the same battles, but just the possibility of change is, I think, new.
Mm-hmm. And here's a question. This is a little challenging, but it continues on. And thank you for the info about the flag. One of my favorite things to do with travelers is when we walk up to the Civil Rights Museum, I ask them, so what do you not see in front of this museum? And
Yep.
people stand around. We talk about the flagpoles not being there. So, with the horrifying murder of George Floyd, it seems that it has penetrated white complacency, the long history and presence of racist violence. How do you think it's best to keep that opening alive and open and happening? How do we make sure this isn't just like a hot summer?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And, for all of you who've visited us and have met me, and if you've heard me talk about these issues, I try to be very clear about my role as a white man with an advanced degree who's heterosexual, Christian, represents all the sources of power throughout American history, right? How it is incumbent on me, and I've said this, to go beyond being an ally and to become an advocate, and to advocate for change in America, because the system has been created to serve me. It was people like me who created all of the barriers to advancement that are out there for the benefit of white men particularly. And so it's incumbent upon us to do the work. One of my good friends who's an activist here in Jackson, Albert Sykes, likes to say that you've got white people work to do. And we do. And I think that we all who are sympathetic and empathetic and support these movements, particularly those of us who are white Americans, it is incumbent upon us to keep these conversations going, and we all have a role to play. I say often, none of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. We can do a little bit more. And not everybody is prepared or even has the capacity to jump feet first into work like I do on a regular basis in Mississippi, but every little bit helps. And so just thinking about issues that matter to you and how you can stand up and make your voice heard, whether it's you know, how we change policing in schools. I'm on the school board in Jackson Public Schools. What part of our budget is going towards policing children, right? How do we have those kinds of conversations? And I think all of us can ease into this, and you can ease into first being an ally. I do think being an ally is important, but ultimately more than just being kind of a passive supporter, keeping the topics, these issues that matter at the forefront. And even, you know, something like the pandemic, the disproportionate impact that coronavirus has on marginalized communities and on poor people is another function, as I said in that New York Times op-ed, is another function of state violence. It is a representation of the same forces of power that are in place in the very, what's clear, deliberate murder of George Floyd, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate what you're sharing, and I'll say from a Black perspective, it's, as someone who does this work, it's been wonderful and also very difficult to see white people be so awakened, aware of these issues, because as I said, I had that nightmare, I'm screaming to the void. I told you, and it's a complicated road. Like, I'm very happy people are jumping in and have thoughts and ideas, are taking action. I'm also a little bit, I feel like we need to have a conversation about why you didn't accept it and jump into it earlier. Yeah. It's a challenging moment because it's wonderful and also very frustrating. You know, I'm in a different position. I do this work all the time, and I've committed my life to it, so I'm open to it. But I have had a few moments of just sheer exhaustion.
Yeah.
With folks calling me saying, "I don't want you to take care of me. I know I need to ask you first. How are you? How you doing? What's happening?" And then they go, "Can you take care of me?" I think, it's like, here we go.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some of this chat. Yeah. One of the questions about how do we become advocates, particularly white folks, without replicating patterns of white voices dominating the airspace. One of the ways that we do is open up spaces for Black voices and Black activists and the voices of those people who are marginalized, giving them forums and bringing them into spaces that are traditionally dominated by white voices and listening. The number one thing in the going on 12 years now, I've been in Jackson doing this work. The number one thing I realized within the Black community in and around Jackson was I had to listen. I had to step back, and I had to a certain extent, suppress my urge to jump in and be heard all the time. And that was a learning moment. And I think that we can find spaces for those voices to come in. There, you know, for instance, there's a question about the school board and police and local schools. Jackson Public Schools does have its own official police force for our campuses. And that's been a long time in the creation. And a lot of that had to do with forces around conversations with school shootings in America, right? And how we've been guilty of militarizing our school police and our schools, and bringing metal detectors and other things into the schools to try and provide safe space in a way that I think is ultimately misguided. And you know, we begin the work of making those changes. Like I said, we're going to be adopting a budget for the next academic year for our schools here in Jackson. And, you know, we got to raise the question, how much money are we spending on guns
Mhm.
for our police force, right? Where we show our priorities often in our budgets, right? And whether or not we live what we say we want to, what we espouse in those places. And so I think we have an opportunity to do work that lifts up those marginalized voices and raises questions in environments that are historically all white, and have a chance to maybe change some of that narrative and bring some of those other voices to the table.
Yeah, you've answered one of the questions that was in here, and I'll amplify it a bit in terms of why do we think white people are just waking up or stepping up and saying something. I think that if we believe that systemic racism is a real thing in our American society, there are ways that we function within it. And you are told on a daily basis that your opinion, your thoughts are right. I'm told on a daily basis that mine are not, and I need to be quiet and apologize and be complacent. So I think people are for the first time going, whoa, this is a moment. And I think also there's a mixture of things too. We're locked in our houses. There's no sports to watch. The TV probably gets a little taxing. There are no big events. People aren't traveling. People have to sit down and really be with themselves. And I think there was the pot just boiled over when it came time for folks to jump in.
Yeah.
So seeing these images really turn things completely around. And I'll say this, because this is my solution for what's called the school resource officers,
right?
Police officers in schools. I think they need to replace that with grandparents. Like, a grandma in the hallway, like, are you going to class? Or grandpa standing there like, I see you in the hallway. I think that would be a better solution than officers with guns. I've gone to schools and you walk up to the front desk and the guy puts his hand on his gun and says, can I help you?
Yeah.
At the front of a school, that's crazy.
Yeah, and it's particularly bothersome in a school district like ours that is 95% African American and poor. And I think you're right on about the pandemic. I've been asked in some interviews that I've done about why this moment, why now? And I think the reality is people are hurting and they are suffering from the isolation and from the economic hardship, and people were ready to just explode. And George Floyd was the linchpin that really brought all of that out to the surface. Media has always played a key role in the civil rights movement. We think about the images of Emmett Till. We think about police dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, right? And so those moments that are captured in media are essential. But when you combine it with the pandemic and the specific historical moment we were in, people were ready to take to the streets, and white America was paying attention because of it. And it fueled this just explosion of anger, which I think is actually righteous anger. And I've argued that what we see in the peaceful demonstrations and in what has turned to violence, right, in the streets, is in some ways, and actually in every way, rooted in the same causes and part of the same message. And when the dispossessed, when the poor, when the marginalized have no resources except to turn to the streets and to through militant action demand justice, that there's a righteousness to that, even if you and I aren't out burning down the Wendy's in Atlanta, right? But there's a righteousness in that impulse that is just as valid as the peaceful demonstrators and protesters. But anyway, so there's lots of great questions I see.
Well, you mentioned one that I think is really good. They're all great, but this one is a great one to follow what you said. The police started as a slave patrol.
Right.
And as we trace back up to African Americans migrating up north and lots of immigrants coming in, it turned into controlling the poor, with a focus on African Americans, keep them in line after slavery was ended.
Right.
What do you think? What are your suggestions for getting rid of qualified immunity?
Yeah, I saw that question out there too. I mean, I think it begins with reforming all of how we police in America, right? And reforming what we expect of police officers, and reforming what we train them to do and don't do. Yeah, how do we get rid of qualified immunity? I mean, I don't know that we're going to see a Supreme Court case go through that's going to, overturn that right immediately. But if we change what types and styles of weapons police officers are allowed to carry, right? And when in the most isolated cases they're ever able to use deadly force, right? That if we start training them in community policing and engaging communities in ways that build those places up, as opposed to being community support instead of being community police, that what you'll see is the need for qualified immunity to disappear, right? if we can retrain, there's even people and places that are, I know this happened in New Jersey, right, where they abolished police forces, made every police department, every police officer reapply for their jobs, and started all over in training people on what to expect and what to do. And there are just some common sense changes that we can make. And some of it is getting obscured in the rhetoric around defund police. I know everybody on this call kind of understands the complexity of it, but that becomes a speaking point, right, for the far right to say, well, we're gonna abolish all police. That's not what anybody is talking about, but just some of the common sense reforms that we can push for and change immediately. And we see places are actually doing it. I think that's hopeful.
Yeah, someone asked, did the Supreme Court make a mistake by not passing qualified immunity? Was it good or bad? I'm of the mind that was bad to pass on it. That police you mentioned, that was in Camden, New Jersey. Part of Philadelphia. Really difficult community that had been deprived of so much for so long. And they as you said, they fired everybody. They had to reapply. I actually do know some people who are pushing for a complete abolition, destruction, deconstruction of the police department, and turn it into a guardian program versus a warrior. And they lay out programs like, if you see somebody asleep in a car that's drunk, go over to them, give them an Uber, get them home, call them the next day. Don't go and shoot them. Don't go and shoot them. I saw a question come up that I thought would be good to respond to about the George Floyd murder. Someone said, don't you think it also was because there was absolutely no question that Floyd's death was murder and the cop was so arrogant? There was no doubt. Respond to that, then I'm gonna get a response to it.
I think that's some of it, but we've seen that before, and we've seen it in other cases over and over and over again. And whether it's police officers or whether it's, the case of Trayvon Martin. I mean, so the arrogance and the hostility of the white police officer is nothing new. I think still so much of it was about just this moment in time and where people were ready and prepared to just to demand change and to take to the streets.
I think when history looks back at it, someone asked, how we see this 25 years from now? The same way we read about Emmett Till or read about Fannie Lou Hamer, read about all those people and hear all the pieces and story. I bet the major pieces will be, gentleman killed in Georgia. Months later, the country starts whispering about saying this is problematic. Another woman killed a few months before that, country whispering about it. The Central Park incident, which was a reflection of someone doing what many white women across the country have been doing in terms of calling the cops on police. Then the George Floyd case happened, and we were in a pandemic. That'll probably be like the first sentence. But I think, when I'm asked to speak about Black Lives Matter, police brutality, et cetera, I'm not a police officer. So I have a cop that's a friend of mine here in New York City. And I call him and ask him. When the Eric Garner situation happened, I called and said, man, I just saw that video. What do you think? And he said to me, he said, Andre, the officer will not be indicted, will not get in any trouble. And I said, no, that can't be true. He goes, no, trust me, watch. And sure enough, we talked about, I said, well, what, the chokehold's illegal in New York. He said, I know, but you can say it's not a chokehold for what I see. It talked about it and really spoke as an officer. And he said, I would hate for you to see some of the things that I have to do as an officer to restrain people. And we left it at that. Now, when the George Floyd moment happened, he sent me a message out of the blue and said, I want you to know that everyone in my precincts, we see this as an assassination. This is a murder. And someone made the point to me and said, you know, if you ever see somebody hunting deer, that pose he had on his neck was what you do when you're trying to, when you fell a deer, you're trying to keep it down. You know, that was a pure knee on the neck hunting position. So I think years from now, hopefully we'll be in a much better position and we'll be able to reflect back on this, and we'll have grown and changed as we have since the other civil rights movement, you know. But I do think, I agree with you that this case wasn't something worse than what we've seen. We have many cases like this. And I'll also say this, I do not watch these videos anymore.
Yeah.
After the Tamir Rice video just, you know, floored me. And I haven't watched the George Floyd video, and I do it on purpose. I read about it, I've seen photos, but I think these are sacred moments that I don't need to witness. I think it hurts too much to actually see them.
Yeah, and I think it's important, particularly for those of us who are white Americans, to understand the trauma and to try, although we're never going to face it in the same manner, but to at least have some empathy and understanding about how traumatic this is for so many of our brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
I also see a question here about the film Mississippi Burning.
Oh, boy.
And I think it's related to specifically something that we're talking about here. Mississippi Burning is just fictitious to the extreme, and giving kind of all of the heroism is on the FBI, right, and on Gene Hackman's character, and like they're responsible for finding Goodness, Renner, and Cheney and bringing them to bringing some kind of justice in the case. That is completely fictitious, right? But one thing that has happened is that that particularly white power brokers have controlled the narrative of American history that's especially embedded kind of in the consciousness. And they have framed that narrative in ways that makes us feel good about American democracy and the American experiment. And I think we got to be really careful with that. And particularly in this moment, be willing to stand up and to say that this narrative isn't redemptive, and that what's being demanded of Black Lives Matter is a fundamental issue of justice and basic human dignity that isn't just. I firmly believe in the lessons of the civil rights movement, that this does not come, change is not going to come from a top-down savior like the FBI that's going to fix us all. Instead, it's going to bubble up from the grassroots, from the bottom, from all of us demanding change. And we just got to be aware of that narrative and how that narrative is framed, and challenge it when it covers what is the true story, what is the real story of all of this.
I'm going to sum up two questions here, but I want to ask another one first. You know, you're in Jackson, Mississippi. What are protests and pushback like in an area, you know, that is in New York City and Jackson, Mississippi are two different places? Yeah. Are people showing up in Jackson?
2 weeks ago, actually a week ago this past Saturday, we had the largest civil rights demonstration in downtown Jackson since 1966. And the Meredith March Against Fear, when 30,000 protesters arrived in Jackson. It was remarkable, and it was people of all ages, it was people of all races, gender identities. It was, the streets of Jackson were flooded, and they had a series of speakers, and when folks started to march, you look down Capitol Street in Jackson and down State Street in Jackson, and as far as you could see in every direction were people. Wow. And so, and that was repeated in towns, small towns across the state of Mississippi. There have been protests like that going on, which is reassuring. Now, there are still plenty of people out there, particularly in places like Mississippi, who are on the other extreme. But there was an incredible spirit, and it felt like we were at a moment of change just by the nature of the people who gathered. And it was nonviolent. There was nothing that happened outside of a peaceful protest, but I would say it was militant too. And it was people demanding justice and demanding that something changed. So it was beautiful, and to see it in Jackson, it's ironic that the protest started in Jackson in front of the governor's mansion. There's a wall today built around the governor's mansion in Jackson that was built in 1970 after the police shootings at Jackson State, and protesters marched on the governor's mansion in 1970. So the very wall that is built around the governor's mansion was built after police shootings on our campus that murdered 2 young men, and no one was ever held accountable. So again, that historic connection from the past to the present.
Mm. Let me read these 2, and then we can dig into it. Someone said, would you be willing to discuss how policing practices are representative of a larger cultural attitudes? And then, although police brutality is horrific, it is only perhaps the worst of the racism. How can we refund our school systems? How can we change even more white people's hearts? How can we have decent health care for all? How can we uproot white people's greed and willing to give up things for others?
That will be hard. That's a lot to accomplish. And again, none of us are going to accomplish this by snapping our fingers, and it's not going to change overnight. I honestly think that here in this setting, we're preaching to the choir. Essentially, everybody believes we're generally all on the same page here.
The choir needs rehearsal. So
yeah, that is very true. But where I've seen it work in Mississippi is when you can engage in dialogue, honest dialogue across some of these divides in safe spaces where people, particularly on the far right, don't see themselves as under attack, and they're going to have to be in a place that's safe enough for them to drop kind of the veil. I've seen this conversation happen through churches, especially in Mississippi, where all Black and all white churches get together and they bring congregants together to share these conversations. And so I think it mostly happens through dialogue, and it happens. I think it's a lot. I do think George Floyd changed a lot of people's hearts and minds about this. And it is a moment where people said, okay, where they might have been shouting, all lives matter. Now they're going, all right, Black lives do matter and all lives don't matter until Black lives matter. Right? And I think that's changed some people's hearts. But accomplishing all of it and accomplishing a just and equitable world for all people is, likely not something that's going to happen in our lifetimes, but it's something that we can all work towards a little bit at a time.
And I won't necessarily push back on that, but I'll say what surprised. I never imagined, sadly, in my lifetime of seeing a little bit of police reform and a little bit of police actually being immediately held accountable for what they're doing. That's happening now.
Yeah.
It's not happening everywhere, but it's happening enough. It's, for me, the part that makes me lean more towards your side in that, in terms of how long it'll take, is I think about, we right now have 2 lynchings in California in a community that is known for having a very heavy presence of the KKK.
Right.
And the first response was, well, he hung himself. It was suicide. It wasn't a lynching. And luckily, the families felt strong enough to say, wait a minute, we know our children, we know these communities, and push back. But we are, and that is, so to go back a little bit to that first question of why it's so hard for people to change and all the things that were listed that are going to take, we can have policies, we can have laws, we can have practices, but until the individuals decide to actually change, I think we'll stay right where we are. People have to step up. I think people, the whole discussion of privilege and access and ability, these are very hard concepts to understand because systemic racism is so successful. It is a successful moving machine. It's almost a perfect machine. And the fact that people fight over who is not racism, that's like putting coal into the boat.
Yeah.
And the boat just keeps on sailing. And we have to shift that dumping of coal and put it in the right spots. And my real belief on this is that it's up to people to talk about that change. And someone said, asked me to talk more about feelings of frustration. Why don't white people listen? that echoes in what I just said right now. You've been told you don't have to listen all this time, and also I personally have lived a life, even though I'm an advocate and fight for it, I know the ways that I limit how much I demand and ask for and change and challenge. I'll tell a story, and this was not with a Nation Travelers. This was another group I traveled with. Now you all know the trip. The trip is intense. By the time we get to Montgomery, we're like in another way of thinking and functioning. I had a traveler, an older white woman, come to me with a sheet of paper. She had a list. And she said, I want to talk to you about some questions that I have. I'm like, oh, great. She's learned. Let's see what happened. She had N blank on the paper. And she goes, I want to know why I can't say, and she didn't say the N word. She said the word with the hard ER.
Wow. And
I'm sitting here thinking like, you've been with me for like 5 days traveling the South looking at history. What do you mean? And one of our travelers had sang Mississippi Goddamn. And her position was, I was more offended by goddamn than I was by the N word. She said, I grew up in my small town and we had said all the words, and she proceeded to list them out. And I didn't see a problem with it. And I was looking at her thinking like, what's going on with you? What is in your heart and in your mind that you said the word, and I counted 8 times. You said the N word to me with the hard R 8 times. And I have to take care of you, make sure you get on the plane and get home safely. That was a moment of saying, once again, I understood Dr. King's message about love, where I wanted to throw rocks at her head, but that's not what I was going to do. I had to come back with love and support and get her through the rest of the trip and accept that some people just aren't going to get there.
Oh yeah, and I would echo that too. And I told you the story about, I've been on 2 different Zoom programs in the last 6 weeks since May 14th, 15th, where we've had white supremacists take over and bomb the Zoom chat. And in the Zoom chat, they spewed the most hateful racist language, including posting swastikas and talking about lynching those of us who were on the panel. It's happened to me twice now in the last month. Some people aren't going to be saved.
Yeah.
There are some people we're just not going to fix.
Yeah.
Right? And we have to understand that too. Not everybody's going to be brought into this world of justice. And I see the issues about over here about systemic racism and white liberals. Yes, we all have our biases that we have to check and think about. It's like when I pull up to a stoplight and I see a panhandler, why is my immediate response to lock my door? Right? I've thought about that. So we all have biases that we've got to admit, and only in admitting can we deal with them. And that's uncomfortable. And one thing that white liberals especially need to do is be ready to be uncomfortable talking about race and racism and white supremacy. And it's okay to be uncomfortable, because in that uncomfort, you are actually thinking about and challenging and rethinking kind of your status. So that is one thing that we can all really do.
Yeah, I agree with that. So something we do, and for someone who's asking what the RR, it's the N word. I'm not saying the word, but there's like there are various ways to say it. And the one word with the ER is to say it the way that a Southern plantation owner would speak about his slave. Yeah. That's as far as I'll go with it. I'll encourage you to Google to figure out the rest, because I want to let that rest and move past it. Something you said in terms of getting uncomfortable, part of my work is all about getting people to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And something I say, and I didn't say it at the beginning of some of our trips, but I said it towards the last couple of trips. I say to folks, we look around the room and see who's with us on this tour here at the Nation. It's majority white, because as we talk about and take apart history and look at wealth and economic distribution, many people here in the room, you benefited from the building of wealth. And now at a retired age, you have the money to be able to do this. And many African Americans do not. I heard a great report this morning on the radio, I think on NPR, maybe yesterday, where the gentleman was talking about, there's a neighborhood in Detroit, I think it was, or somewhere, and there's one house with this particular value. Next door neighbor was a black family. And the white family was talking about, oh, we can't wait, we're gonna redo our kitchen. And the black man who said, I wish I could afford to do my kitchen, but I can't. I've been a post office worker all my life, so I have a great pension, I'm doing well. but I have relatives in prison and incarcerated and other relatives who need help and support. So there's a discussion that with white people, it tends to be economic travels up. With African Americans, the wealth travels back.
Absolutely.
There's so many folks to take care of and support.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And this is very much a topic that is tied directly to economic justice and as well as social justice and anti-racist work. They're all combined. You can't talk about race in Mississippi without talking about poverty. In America, I realize, but within the context that I'm in Mississippi, they are just intrinsically tied together. In this moment of COVID, thinking about our school district, you know, I was talking with you about this. We moved to an online system of learning, but in our district, the majority of our children don't have access to Wi-Fi at home. And you're going to an online system of learning, and yet your children have no access to that learning at all. No Wi-Fi, much less computers at home. They might have a cell phone, but that's it. We had to come up with a way to print roughly 6 million pages of instructional packets and deliver to children in our school district so that they could have physical learning resources for the rest of our school year. And just the very basic assumption that this technology is ubiquitous. I see somebody's put that's made her really angry as well. It was something that not enough of us were talking about and recognizing. And even my own students at Jackson State this semester, of course, Jackson State is a historically Black college, and we're 92% African American, and the majority come from Mississippi as a state school. That's not a surprise. I lost 40 to 50% of my students this semester. They just were gone. They just disappeared. Right. And that's not because they just decided they were, you know, done with their education. It's because they didn't have access. When they're on campus, they get access to computer labs and to Wi-Fi because they're on campus. So those issues are definitely intrinsically linked.
Yeah, and to continue on with that, because someone made a great suggestion about, you know, use school buses as Wi-Fi spots in neighborhoods. Yes, and what has to come along with that is shifting the mindset, belief, feelings of access to participating in society at an equal level also. Like there's a whole lot of mindset to deconstruct. I know I'm successful, but I have to personally fight against all the things I've been told, all the moments that lead me to places of doubt in American society as a Black man, as a person of color, as someone who grew up lower income. It's a lot to unpack and uncover. So yes, try and put the buses in the neighborhood and bring programs and people in place that can help folks get to that space. You know, someone said something here that I thought was really good, and I want to then turn to a question about reparations. So prepare your answer for reparations. But someone said the idea that white people are going to make mistakes. You know, yes, you know, something, I hope I said it to you all on the tour. First draft. Allow for first draft in these conversations. You're going to make a mistake when talking about this. So you know what? That was my first draft. Let me try again. And then allow your response to be a first draft. Because if we just walk in and say, well, you said that, that's your opinion, I don't want to talk to you ever again, we'll never get anywhere. We have to stumble and get back up. So, Robert Luckett, how do we do reparations in America?
We begin slowly but surely. You've heard me say that I support reparations, and I think it will be an essential tool. And look, I mean, there are cities and places that are discussing reparations in very legitimate ways right now. And places like, was it Georgetown University that, you know, started thinking about how it was founded, and it was built with basically wealth that was built on the backs of enslaved people, right? So I think that as places and leaders and people begin the conversations about reparations and begin implementing it, what we're going to see is that it's going to become more and more part of a normalized conversation. And as that happens, slowly but surely, it starts to to seep into conversations that are happening in our state legislatures, that are happening in Congress. And the very fact that we're at a moment in time where there are places having this very real conversation around reparations it is hopeful. It's going to take a long time. I mean, I still live in a state where 60% of our legislature are Tea Party members, right? They have supermajorities in both houses of the legislature, which means that they can control all finances, because with a supermajority, you can pass anything you want to in terms of budget amendments. So do I think reparations are going to come to Mississippi anytime soon? No, probably not. But it's probably going to begin in places like San Francisco and some of the more kind of progressive places that are having these conversations. And as such, over time, it'll become normalized. But I do think it's an essential part of the long-term solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love our travelers, the things they're shouting out here. They're really good. Is America addicted to racism? Yeah, we don't even know it. 12-step program, right? That's good. I think, I'm with you. I will say this, and I'll ask maybe Deborah, Teresa, if you can find a link and plop it into the chat. I recommend everyone reread Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations. I think reading that I reread it a couple days ago. Rereading that right now will really like he was like predicting moments that are happening. So I recommend checking that out. And it's, it's hard. There are intense programs to rebuild and restructure. I think there are communities that we can look at in America that have done a fairly good job of taking care of themselves. But I want to run this in terms of reparations. So that's another angle. I wanted to ask you this, because we're seeing monuments being taken down. You mentioned the flag. What do you think of these monuments being ripped apart, torn apart?
Again, I think it's part of a righteous anger and movement, and I'm for it. We are having the debate right now, and I joined a group of community leaders across the state that penned an op-ed about taking down the state flag. But the University of Mississippi, which has had a Confederate soldier at the prow of its campus, they have voted, IHL, Institutions of Higher Learning, that governs our colleges and universities in Mississippi, has voted to move that statue and to take it down from the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, right? Which is etymology of Ole Miss is the slave, right? The Ole Miss is on the plantation. Yeah. So I think it's hopeful. I think it's long overdue and about time. And the fact that it can happen in a place like the University of Mississippi is really a remarkable moment in time.
Mm-hmm. And you just did something that is necessary too. Every time I hear Ole Miss, I get a little like, nah, little cringe. And by adding in saying Ole Miss and it's that, we live in a world where we don't do that. We're trained not to do that, and we let these things stay in place. We let the flags fly. We let the names of projects and places stay on us. I'll recommend, and this may shock everybody, but I'll recommend Dolly Parton. I never ever thought I would say that, but her podcast is called Dolly Parton's America. They talk a lot about history, and they actually, in one episode, Jed Ambarad is the host, they talk about our misunderstanding and our misuse of the term redneck and hillbilly. And it's more based on a book called Everything You Know About Appalachia Is Wrong. I'm not remembering the author's name, but the podcast is fantastic. We'll find it and send it. Also, it's called Dolly Parton's America. But what it did is it talks about how we in America, we rewrite history constantly to fit our needs. And that is really problematic. And that is how we fall into these spaces of repetition and don't get to advance. And by saying Ole Miss, which refers to, that's the change that we're seeing right now that I'm hopeful about. And there's things I think I've sort of sit back and not said so aggressively, but we have to come forward with this. We have to share these ideas and turn them down. Because Robert E. Lee said in his last letters of the last years of his life, do not memorialize me. We lost. And if we believe in this union, we need to come together again and focus on the union, not the celebration. The Civil War, the Confederacy, I should say, lasted 5 years. Not 120 years, not 1,000 years like Ireland or other places. Can you see my fingers? 5 years. And how are we celebrating that as an American legacy? How is that considered white history? You know,
there's legislation in Congress to change all of the Army bases that are named after Confederate generals right now, to change that.
Fort Bragg, get out of here.
I don't know if anybody saw General David Petraeus's op-ed about all of the reasons to take it down and how he came to this learning and understanding about, why are we celebrating first people who fought to maintain an institution of slavery. And if you look at Mississippi's Articles of Secession, it lists about 10 bullet points, and all of them are slavery, 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 all the reasons why Mississippi seceded. And we're training men and women to take an oath to the United States Constitution, uphold the Constitution, and we're training them in places that are named for people who were traitors to that Constitution and who acted on treason. But yeah, it is a moment in time where I'm hopeful with those changes, and I do believe symbols matter. Yes. They impact people, yes. And many friends of mine can in the Black community here in Jackson will talk about their deep feelings of trauma when they see the Mississippi flag.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it's real. Yeah. And so these things do matter, and they're part of that incremental change.
Yeah, yeah. I saw someone just say that. I was thinking about that. I do hope there are a few Confederate people, the statues in D.C. in the Capitol.
Yeah.
The states won't take them out. We're getting close to the time. I want to ask you, how's COFO? How are you all doing with all that's happening right now?
COFO is quiet. I mean, but it's still there, and we're still engaging our community. We're still doing lots of incredible programming. Even the event that we did for the 50th commemoration of the police shootings at Jackson State has now had over 12,000 views, and we're still trying to create spaces for dialogue and discussion. Much of that is virtual now out of necessity and the fact that we aren't open. And I've seen a few questions about Jackson and what's going on here and with our elections in Mississippi. I gotta say, I am deeply concerned about what's going to happen in the elections, especially in terms of holding fair and open elections. And one of the things that I think that we've got to be very intent on and outspoken about is making sure that the elections are not hijacked out of some kind of.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah, and I think that is a possibility, and the fears of our Secretary of State who governs elections in Mississippi has already said he's absolutely opposed to mail-in voting because it is just rife with fraud and abuse, which there is no evidence at all to uphold.
No.
And so we do have a growing kind of progressive force in Mississippi and voices as seen in the crowd for these demonstrations, but the status quo is not changing in Mississippi anytime soon, which makes the work that we do at COFO and in Jackson, continue to be incredibly important.
Right, but you'll be there for us when we come back someday, right?
Yeah, I will be. I'm not going anywhere. I've told you all I have tenure, so they can't fire me. I'm going up for full professor this year, so hopefully that'll happen by the next time.
Good luck.
See you. We do have an election in Mississippi this year that is a rematch of our U.S. Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith and Mike Espy, who you may remember several years ago ran in a special election to fill Thad Cochran's seat, in which Cindy Hyde-Smith, the Republican, at a campaign stop, talked about how she was happy to attend lynchings, public hangings with her friends. And they are running against each other and are in the general election. Again, Mike Espy was the first Black Mississippian to be elected to Congress since Reconstruction. He was also Secretary of Agriculture under Bill Clinton. I don't have a real good read on how that's going to fall out. I'm afraid that Mike doesn't have a super strong chance in that. And I think Cindy Hyde-Smith will likely win, but it's one of the few interesting points. And I see someone talking about does Doug Jones in Alabama have a prayer? He won once.
Yeah. And so did Jeff Sessions.
There's a prayer.
Right. Jeff Sessions won once too. He's coming out his mouth.
And somebody's asking about COFO. Obviously, COFO was the Council of Federated Organizations. It was a uniquely Mississippi civil rights group that was organized by the great activist Bob Moses, who's still alive and lives in Florida today. We see Bob back in Mississippi from time to time. And the idea was to bring civil rights groups that often had pretty intense rivalries in other places, bring them together under one umbrella and operate in Mississippi. So the four big ones were the NAACP, Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which organized the Freedom Rides in 1961, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was Bob Moses' organization. And so they came together, created this umbrella group in Mississippi, and the COFO Center, which I run, was the state headquarters for that organization in Jackson, and was the headquarters in 1964 for Freedom Summer, when those 800 plus volunteers will come to Mississippi to work. So yeah, that's a good question. I realize not everybody has been to COFO who's on this. And
I think starting on our third trip, we start coming. We met you on our second trip, and you said, y'all should come to COFO.
Yeah.
We all were like, what's COFO? It's been great to have you. I know that you're closed. So go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and we've been grateful to have y'all.
That's great. I know that you're closed through the 2020, but you'll be open in 2021. The tour, in terms of the Nation magazine and our tours, our goal is to be back on track by 2021. Of course, we are waiting to see what happens in the world, but our goal really is to get back. I miss you all. I miss traveling, but we'll try and get that back up. Someone also asked about my films, and Deborah will share more information in the email that we'll send out with the link to this. So hi to Viv, who's in Australia, who's probably asleep right now because it's about 4:57 in the morning. We recorded it for her, and hi to all the people who couldn't watch it with us. We recorded this so you can witness and share some of this information. Thank you for the link for the COFO there, Robert. I'm gonna put a link up now because folks are asking about my films. That link right there will take you to all the information that I have about my films. And I'm Not Racist, Am I? Is actually screening, and there'll be a talk tonight and available through Sunday. And my new one, Virtually Free, is coming. But the newest one that is really exciting, and any minute now, within the next couple of hours or days, you'll see a sneak peek. We filmed our last 2 tours of the Civil Rights Trip. And it was a dream come true to take a camera crew. We did 1 week with junior high school students and a second week with Nation Magazine readers, all sponsored by Nation Magazine and Distant Horizon. And it was absolutely beautiful. And so we had we had some young people come. I stepped my old self aside and let the kids come in and film and travel with us. And the goal with that is to illustrate to people a deeper understanding of the history of America. Not civil rights history, not Black history, American history, through film, and to take folks on some of the journey. And the little piece we have, which will answer a question that was above, someone asked how Mary and Sylvester Hauser were doing. They're doing fine, they're doing great. Sylvester is featured in a little short piece that we have, and that'll be coming hopefully by the fall. But the short piece has 3 minutes. I'm sorry, the feature film will be coming by the fall. The shorter piece, we should release in the next day or so to the folks out there in the world to share with you, because we're really excited to share with you. Also, I want to share one more little piece, a little piece of reparations that we all have done. For folks who have contributed, thank you so much. We are looking to get Miss Annie Pearl, who we visited in Selma, Alabama. We should have her car in the next 2 or 3 weeks. After our last tour, the travelers said, wait a minute, because Miss Annie Pearl's car got hit by a train. She's totally safe and fine, but she doesn't have a car. And our travelers said, let's buy her a car. And so we did a GoFundMe campaign that's in its last days, and we're gonna get her a car. I'm so excited about this. So thank you all to everyone that contributed. And that's how you do it. That's reparations. We'll learn more about that. That's in my link tree, the link to the whole campaign for the GoFundMe. And I'm just, we are the change that we're talking about. And I'll say some last few things and let you say some stuff, Robert, that we'll close out. I just really appreciate you all leaning into this conversation. This is the way to do it. you know, we are preaching to the choir, but as I say, the choir needs rehearsal. And sometimes the choir needs to figure out what song we're actually singing before we go out and do the work. So I'm just glad you all are here and taking part in this work, and for being folks that stand by and help with this.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And I've been grateful to get to know so many of you and to have you visit. You know, please step out and be the change that you want to see, and be willing to make mistakes, be willing to be uncomfortable, and work on being allies, but also being actors and being more than just allies.
Excellent. Great. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you, everybody, so much. And I think that's it for now. I'm glad we did this. Shout out to Rick Fellman for pushing for this and all the people.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. And thanks to the nation for making this available, and Teresa, you guys for being supportive of having this conversation happen. Glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you both. And thank you for everyone who joined us today. We had a tremendous response, and I saw somebody asking. I will send out a link. I'll send it out this afternoon, so you can share this with friends and family and others who were not able to join us this afternoon. Robert, Andre, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time.